Life was loud. The city never really slept. Horns, sirens, the buzz of people always rushing somewhere. Ares was one of them. 31, successful by society's definition. A rising architect with a corner office, a sleek car, and a neatly planned future. He ticked all the boxes. His parents were proud. His colleagues envied him. But none of it made his chest feel light. Inside, everything was noise, deadlines he couldn't escape, clients he couldn't satisfy, arguments with himself in mirrors, smiles that felt staged. Every day felt like running underwater, fast, heavy, breathless. And then came that Thursday. He was early for a meeting and ducked into a quiet bookstore cafe, a place tucked between two glass towers, almost invisible, unless you were really looking. The bell chimed above the door, and the scent of coffee wrapped around him like a soft blanket. The air felt different inside, like time had slowed down. He ordered an espresso, phone in hand, already replying to emails when someone pulled his gaze. She was seated near the window, legs folded beneath her on a velvet chair, a thick book resting gently on her lap. Her hair cascaded like a curtain down one side of her face, hiding everything but the quiet curve of a smile. She wasn't looking around. She wasn't posing for anyone. She was just still. And that stillness hit him harder than any storm. He watched her for a moment too long before blinking himself back into focus. But something inside had already shifted. The world, once blaring and fast, had suddenly muted. He sat down across the room, deliberately choosing a chair with a view. Not of the street, not of his phone, of her. He wasn't sure what made her so different. Maybe it was how she turned the pages like each word mattered. Maybe it was the way she took small sips of her drink like she was tasting life, not rushing through it. Maybe it was just the contrast, his chaos and her calm. Ares tried to go back to his screen, but nothing on it felt as urgent anymore. He watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear and smile at something in her book. That small, effortless smile stirred something inside him, something that hadn't moved in years. He didn't know what it was exactly, only that it was real, present, for the first time in a long while. He wanted to be still too, not because he was tired, but because, suddenly, stillness looked like peace. He stayed there longer than he planned, sipping slowly, phone forgotten. Every now and then, she'd glance up, not at him, but out the window, watching the world pass with soft eyes. Eyes that looked like they had seen sadness and still chose softness. Eyes that didn't need to shout to be heard. She left before he could find the courage to say hello, but as she walked past, their eyes met, just briefly. She didn't smile, she didn't speak, but something passed between them. A question maybe, or a recognition. He left the cafe a little later, heart oddly full. The streets were still loud, but the noise didn't reach him the same way. Inside him, something had quieted. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if he'd see her again, but he knew this much. He had everything on paper, but she reminded him of everything he was missing in spirit: stillness, presence, peace, and maybe, just maybe, love. Her name was Noor, a name that meant light, and somehow, it suited her in ways words couldn't capture. She wasn't radiant in the blinding way of chandeliers or camera flashes. No, she glowed like the last candle in a dark room. Soft, warm, steady. Ares didn't ask her name immediately. That would have felt too forward, too loud. And she wasn't a woman you approached with noise. He had started coming to the bookstore cafe every evening after that first encounter. Not with any elaborate plan or hope. He just wanted to be near the quiet she carried. His days still roared with meetings and emails and calls, but those stolen twilight hours watching her read, or sip her tea, or write something in a little brown journal became the only part of his routine that felt real. Noor didn't speak much. In fact, he went several days without hearing her voice at all. But there was music in her silences. When the barista handed her a cup, she responded with a smile so genuine it made the room feel less artificial. When someone accidentally bumped her chair, she simply looked up, eyes full of forgiveness, and nodded without saying a word. She was grace, even in stillness. Ares found himself drawn not just to her beauty, but to the way she carried herself. Her laugh, on the rare occasions he heard it, didn't echo like most people's. It didn't demand attention. It lingered, like perfume on a scarf, like a line from a poem that sticks with you for hours. At first, he only watched from afar, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Some silences are sacred, and he didn't want to break hers carelessly. He knew his world loud, ambitious, fast-paced might clash with hers, and he didn't want to ruin the calm she had built around herself. But one evening, as she sat near the window scribbling in her journal, he found himself walking toward her. It felt less like a decision and more like gravity pulling him forward. He cleared his throat softly. "Hi," he said, voice tentative. Noor looked up. For a second, he was sure she wouldn't respond, that maybe he'd overstepped the unspoken boundary they'd shared. But then she smiled. Not a big smile, just a quiet curve of her lips, followed by a small nod. And somehow, that simple nod felt louder than any hello he'd ever heard. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask for anything more. He just nodded back, heart racing, and walked away with the kind of warmth that spreads from the inside out. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not her face, not her figure, just the way her silence made him feel seen without ever demanding to be understood. Over the next few days, their interactions grew gradually, gently, a shared glance, a polite wave, a knowing smile when the barista got his order wrong again. He still didn't know much about her, not what she did for work, not where she lived, but he knew how she made him feel, calm, grounded, present, like she existed in a different rhythm, and just by being near her, he was learning how to breathe again. Some people come into your life like storms. Noor arrived like still water, and Erez was already learning how to float. It started simply. Erez noticed one evening that Noor always ordered the same drink, cinnamon chai with a splash of oat milk. He mentioned it to the barista before she arrived one day, and when she walked in, the drink was already waiting. She looked at Erez, eyes curious. He smiled, half shy. "I noticed you like it this way." Noor didn't say anything at first. She just nodded with that familiar softness in her eyes, then took a slow sip. The tiniest smile tugged at her lips, like a thank you spoken without sound. After that, things began unfolding slowly, like a well-worn book being reopened from the middle. They began recommending books to each other by leaving them at the corner of the caf table. He once left her The Alchemist with a note inside, for someone who already listens to the world's silence. The next day, she left a copy of The Little Prince for him, the page dog-eared at a quote that read, "What is essential is invisible to the eye," and Erez understood she was telling him that silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was everything unsaid, but still deeply felt. Sometimes, after rain, they would walk. The streets glistened with puddles and lamplight. She'd walk just slightly ahead, hands behind her back, letting the mist fall gently in her hair. He wouldn't speak unless she did, and that became a language between them, quiet, deliberate, and meaningful. Noor didn't fill silences with words. She filled them with presence. And Erez, who had lived his life rushing from moment to moment, was learning how to be still beside her. One evening, they sat on an old wooden bench at the edge of a park. The rain had just stopped. Drops still clung to the leaves, and the scent of petrichor lingered in the air. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping their coffee and watching the world soften around them. Then, without looking at him, Noor asked in a voice so gentle it almost disappeared into the wind, "Why are you always running?" The question startled Erez, not because it was invasive, but because it was true. All his life, he'd kept moving, from one job to another, one city to the next, chasing something he couldn't name. He looked down at his hands, took a breath, and then replied honestly, "Because I never knew how to stop." The words hung there, vulnerable, real. She didn't respond with a lecture or a solution. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his, light, calm, steady. That touch didn't ask for attention. It gave it, and in that single, quiet gesture, Erez felt something he hadn't felt in years, grounded. Like the spinning had slowed. Like he didn't have to prove anything here. Like stillness was allowed. His chest ached not with sadness, but with something softer, healing. That night, as they parted ways, Noor handed him a folded piece of paper. No envelope, no explanation. Later at home, he unfolded it. It was a handwritten quote in delicate ink. "Sometimes, the heart needs silence more than answers." He sat there for a long time, rereading it, letting the words settle inside him. He was falling, but not the way people usually fall in love, with chaos and fireworks. He was falling like rain after a long drought, quiet, gentle, life-giving. Erez had mastered the art of smiling with heavy eyes. He was the kind of man who laughed during the day and lay wide awake at night. Behind the calm he wore like a well-fitted suit, a storm lived quietly unseen, unspoken, but always there, peace. With Noor felt like a miracle, but even miracles tremble when touched by the past. He never told her about his father, the way his voice used to turn into thunder after a single misplaced word, or how Eris had learned to walk on eggshells so well, it became second nature. He never spoke of the broken engagement, the woman he loved who left because she couldn't handle his silences, or of the pressure he carried like a second skin. To succeed, to be strong, to never fall apart. He didn't want Noor to see the mess inside him, because she was quiet, beautiful stillness, and he was chaos, tightly sealed. But peace has a way of asking for honesty, gently, patiently. Noor never. Pride. She never asked questions. He wasn't ready to answer. Her presence wasn't loud enough to force him open, but soft enough to make him want to. One evening, Eris came to the cafe late. It had rained. His hair was wet, his shirt clung to him, and his eyes weren't right, not like usual. They were distant, glassy. She looked up from her book and saw him standing there, not moving, as if the weight of just being was too much that day. Noor stood, walked to him, and without a word, took his hand. They didn't sit at their usual table. Instead, she led him to the back garden behind the cafe, a quiet spot with fairy lights hanging low and benches still wet from rain. She pulled a dry blanket from her tote and spread it gently over the seat. They sat in silence. For a few minutes, Eris just stared at his hands, knuckles white, chest rising in uneven breaths. His lips quivered, but he said nothing. Then suddenly, like a dam cracking, he broke. It wasn't a cry. It was a collapse. His shoulders shook, breaths ragged and heavy, and tears poured from a place so deep, it surprised even him. His body trembled, and he leaned forward, hands in his hair, rocking like a boy who hadn't been comforted in years. Noor didn't speak, she didn't ask, she simply reached out and wrapped her arms around him slowly, completely, and held him, and that was everything. Eris cried in her arms for what felt like hours. The rain drizzled again, soft against the leaves above. Somewhere in the distance, traffic hummed, but here, wrapped in Noor's silence, he finally let go. He whispered pieces of the truth between sobs, about his father's temper, the fiancé who left when he needed her most, the weight of failing at everything he was supposed to be good at, the fear that he wasn't enough for the life he was trying to live. She still didn't interrupt. She just stroked his back slowly, her breath steady, grounding his. When the tears began to fade and the tremors dulled, he whispered, "I didn't want you to see this side of me." Noor looked at him with quiet, unwavering eyes, then softly said, "This side is real, and I'm still here." It was the first time Eris realized that love didn't have to arrive with grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes, it showed up in the form of a warm silence, an embrace in the rain, and the courage to fall apart without being abandoned. That night, he didn't go home. They sat on the bench until the sky turned lavender, and for the first time in a long, long while, the storm inside him began to still. Love is strange. When it's real, deep, quiet, unforced, it doesn't scream or demand, but it does terrify. And Eris was terrified. The closer Noor came to his heart, the more afraid he became of her leaving. He had felt that kind of hollow before, when someone promises forever and still walks away. And now, with Noor, it wasn't just love blooming in his chest, it was fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of needing her too much. Fear that someday, she'd see the cracks in him and turn away like the others had. Like many men who don't know how to be held without flinching, he started to retreat. It began subtly. One missed evening at the cafe. Then too, he'd type out replies to her messages only to delete them. He'd pass by the bookstore window and see her sitting at their usual table, a book in hand, eyes occasionally glancing toward the door, waiting. And still, he didn't go in. He told himself he was busy, that he needed space, that Noor deserved someone with less baggage, someone who didn't carry past ghosts into present moments. But the truth? He was scared of being truly seen and loved anyway. Noor didn't bombard his phone with texts. She didn't call over and over. She didn't ask, "What's wrong?" or "Where are you?" She simply waited, not in anger, but in patience. She trusted that when he was ready, he would return. And somehow, that trust broke through the noise in his mind, louder than any accusation could have. One evening, days later, Eris stood outside the cafe's glass door, heart pounding. She was there reading again. Same seat, same soft presence. But something in the air felt different. He stepped inside. She looked up, met his eyes. And instead of smiling like nothing happened, she did something that nearly brought him to his knees. She gently closed her book, set it aside, and held his gaze. You don't need to fight alone anymore, she said. No anger, no questions, just truth. Ares sat down slowly, words caught in his throat. I thought, he began, his voice cracking. I thought if I gave you space from me, you'd realize you deserved better. Nora tilted her head, her expression calm. But I never asked for space, Ares. I asked for presence, not perfection. Tears welled up in his eyes. I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't, she said softly. You hurt yourself trying to protect me from the very parts of you I already accepted. That's when it hit him. Love wasn't about hiding the darkness, but letting someone in enough to light a candle inside it. He reached across the table and took her hand. I don't know how to be all the things you deserve, he admitted. You don't have to be everything, she whispered. Just be here. And so, he stayed. They sat in silence again, not awkward, not empty, but full of understanding, of second chances, of the quiet power of not giving up. That evening, Ares realized something he had never truly believed before. Peace isn't the absence of chaos. It's the presence of someone who sees your chaos and stays anyway. There was no single turning point, no grand gesture, no tear-filled confession, just mornings that started with peace and evenings that ended in quiet companionship. And somewhere between those two edges of the day, Ares found himself changing. Not for Noor, but because of Noor. She never asked him to become someone new. She simply reminded him without words of who he once was before life demanded masks and survival. He had forgotten what it felt like to move through a day without rushing, without proving something to the world. But with her, time slowed. It didn't need to be filled with noise, it just needed to be felt. He started painting again, not to sell, not to impress, just to feel the colors again, to watch something raw and real bleed onto canvas. She never asked to see his work. One day, she just walked into his apartment, noticed a half-finished painting leaning against the wall, and smiled. No compliments, just that smile of hers that said, I see you. He began reading poetry again, 2 quiet verses by Neruda, Rumi, and Faiz. Words that once made him feel too deeply now made him feel just enough. And the strangest thing happened. He started sleeping through the night. No more jolts awake with his heart racing. No more memories crashing into him like waves. Just calm breathing, and dreams that didn't terrify him. She hadn't fixed him. She hadn't tried to. But sometimes presence does what pressure never can. They weren't the kind of couple that turned heads. They didn't post daily declarations of love or dress in matching outfits. They had no audience to perform for. What they had was consistency, kindness, shared silences, and soft laughter. Sometimes they'd sit on his balcony, sipping tea, watching the city hum in the distance. One such evening, Ares turned to her and asked, Why me? She looked at him, expression unreadable at first. Then she said, Because even when you tried to push me away, your soul kept reaching for calm. I just happened to be it. He exhaled deeply. That's when he knew it wasn't about finding the most exciting person. It was about finding the person you could be boring with and still feel whole. The one you didn't need to perform for. The one whose presence didn't demand energy but restored it. That night, as they walked home, he reached out and took her hand, not because he was afraid of losing her, but because he was finally ready to hold on to the version of himself that smiled without guilt, that created without fear, that chose love not as a high, but as a harbor. He had known chaos, he had known noise, but now, he was choosing calm, he was choosing her. And somehow, in that quiet choice, everything finally felt loud enough to be real. The world moved fast, people changed cities, careers, lovers chasing the next big thing, the next loud thrill. But Ares and Noor, they held on to something much quieter. Softness. It had been years now. The bookstore cafe still stood on the same corner street, though the windows had aged and the barista had a few more gray hairs. The menu had changed, the crowd too, but their table by the window remained theirs. Every Sunday morning, they returned to it, same coffee orders, same gentle silence. Noor would sit with a book in hand, her fingers brushing the pages, like she was meeting old friends. Aries would sketch in a little notepad, not professionally, not with purpose, just sketching the way he used to. Often, he'd find himself sketching her, unintentionally, as if his hand remembered the shape of his calm. She still didn't speak much, and he still didn't need her to. Their conversations had always been built between heartbeats, in glances, in shared smiles over old poems, in the way she'd hand him his tea before he even asked for it, in the way he'd always walk on the traffic side of the sidewalk. Small things, soft things. One morning, as sunlight poured through the caf glass and caught the gold in Noor's hair, a young couple at the next table leaned over and asked, "How long have you two been together?" Aries smiled. "Feels like forever," he replied. The girl blushed, amused. "That's rare these days." Aries looked at Noor, who was quietly sipping her tea, eyes still on her page. "She made forever feel safe," he said softly. "That's all it takes." Later that evening, someone asked him again, this time at a dinner party full of noise and laughter, how he knew Noor was the one. He didn't give a dramatic story, no love at first sight glitch, no fireworks or fate speeches. He simply said, "Because when everything else in my life screamed, she stayed quiet, and she loved me anyway." That was the truth of it. In a world that demanded noise, she offered stillness. In a life that had taught him to fight, she taught him how to rest. And rest he did with her, beside her, within the spaces she left for him to simply exist. Over the years, they built a life not out of grand milestones, but of rituals, making tea together in silence, folding laundry with music playing in the background, walking slowly through old bookstores, exchanging handwritten notes tucked into coat pockets. On their 10th anniversary, she gave him a small canvas. It was painted with soft blue and gray swirls, almost abstract, but calming. At the bottom, she'd written, in her neat, quiet handwriting, "For every storm you walk through, thank you for choosing me as your calm." He framed it in his studio, not because it was perfect, but because it was them. Now, every morning feels like that first moment he saw her, still, breathing, existing. And every time he looks at her, even years later, he thinks, this is what it means to be home. They never needed the world to understand. They just needed each other. She was his peace in a chaotic world, and she always would be.